Welcome to the April 6, 2022 Community Formation Commission Special Meeting. We'll call this meeting to order at 5:36. Sam, can we get a roll call, please?
Sure. Commissioner Adam Malikan, absent. Commissioner Alonso,
Here.
Commissioner Chavez,
Present.
Chair Escobedo,
Here.
Commissioner Kim Johnson, Commissioner Rachel Johnson,
Here.
Commissioner Killebrew,
Here.
Commissioner Rodriguez,
Here.
Commissioner Sander,
Here.
Commissioner Wood,
Here.
Vice Chair Zepeda,
Here.
and Commissioner Reyna. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Sam. We will move on to our next item, which is public comment. We do not have any public commenters at the moment, so we will close out public comment for items that are not on today's agenda. We'll move on to our only item for tonight, which is item 4, discussion and review of recommendation language for the oversight model. The Community Formation Commission will discuss and review the recommendation language for the proposed oversight model. The CFC may take action on approving part or all of the language for the purposes of making a recommendation to the City Council. And tonight, we have Cami McElhaney from NACOL, who will be facilitating our conversation today. But before we start, because this meeting is going to be weighty in terms of discussion, I thought it would be important for us to just kind of talk about some ground rules and the structure for today's meeting. If possible, when folks are ready to speak, if you could physically raise your hand, so I'll try and be vigilant and look around, and we'll speak one commissioner at a time. I'll do my best to say the commissioner's name beforehand so the audience watching on YouTube or the recording knows who's speaking. If I miss your name, please just say your name before you start speaking. If comments derail from the topic that we're going through, because I think Cami has portions of the model that each commissioner sent in to talk about. If it derails from the topic, I might kindly interrupt just to focus us back to the conversation at hand. We're aiming for a 8:30 end time, so trying to keep it productive and quick as possible, but we want robust conversation. So please take the time to provide your input. We have to have the final draft for the recommendation by next Wednesday to have it ready so that it's sent out along with the agenda. So we do have a hard deadline, so we want to make sure tonight is as productive as possible. Upcoming steps is after tonight's discussion and we talk about different portions of the model, Cami will go and take that feedback, come up with proposed language, bring it back next Wednesday for us to discuss, and approve the final recommendation. So without further ado, Cami, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's good to see all of you again this evening. I wanted to start by telling you all that I have heard from several commissioners prior to today, and as a result of what they have, information they've sent me, I've taken the final draft recommendations that you completed back in February, and I've highlighted those sections that the commissioners requested that we discuss this evening. My intention is to run through those sections first. Following that and all the discussion surrounding those sections, then we'll take on all of those other sections that maybe other commissioners would like to discuss and we have not already addressed. Just to reiterate, and I know that this is repeating a little bit of what Gabe said, being able to have each of you have an opportunity to speak, given time constraints, is really important. I'd like to hear from everybody so that when I go to do edits to the recommendations, that I have as much input from all of you as possible. As we go through the different sections, when we get to a point where we feel like everyone has said their piece, we may move to straw polls if there seems to be some disagreement on the way that the commission would like to move forward. Once we're done with tonight's meeting, I will take all of the revisions that you have agreed upon tonight, and I will work to include them so that you have them for next Wednesday's meeting. My intention is to have them to all of you by Friday, so you have plenty of time to read through the document with the edits so that you are well prepared for all of the things that we may have to do next Wednesday. So with that, I just want to make sure there are no issues with the format that I proposed before we move on. Okay,
Doesn't look like
seeing
it.
none. Oh, go ahead.
Doesn't look like anyone has feedback.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me. Okay, there we go. I trust you can all see the screen.
Yep.
Okay, so the parts of the recommendations that commissioners had asked that we discuss this evening are highlighted in blue throughout this document. And so I will just move through to those areas and start with them. The first section is in the introduction. The original language is following the murder of George Floyd, the subsequent demands for police reform, and the desire to proactively establish accountability measures. Members of the Santa Barbara community came together to advocate for civilian oversight. There was some desire to further discuss this to see if additional language or explanation was needed as to the purpose or the reason behind the work of this commission.
Louisa?
I'm gonna take this off. Hi, so wow, I'm not used to the microphone. One of the pieces that I noticed in the comments from the community is some rationale as to why the Community Formation Commission is coming in, is being created here. Some community feedback was shared that stated, is it because of something that happened in Santa Barbara, or was this because of something that had to do with at the national level? So I felt it was important to bring this piece up to ensure community members understand that this comes from, and this is a discussion that we can have as a committee, but that it comes from not necessarily something that happened in Santa Barbara, but that it is becoming standard practice across the city, across the country, and that would be an important piece to put in here. That's all I have to say.
Rachel Johnson?
Thank you. Yeah, I am in agreement with Commissioner Wood. I think this is an interesting part because it is also the first thing that folks are going to read of our recommendations. I think a lot of police reform and oversight efforts around the country did start after the murder of George Floyd, but my understanding as well is that for many years there have been different moves toward different types of advisory councils, oversight models, different things that have been at least preliminarily discussed or started. So I would definitely like to learn more if other commissioners have more background or history on that, because I do not. But I do think that's important to kind of separate out. I don't know if we, want to move to sort of strike some specificity about like this. It was in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd when the city council moved on this in terms of creating our commission. So I think that is a fact. But I also think that, yes, we could probably provide more context so that the community as a whole understands that this is a longer, sort of comes out of a longer history. So if anyone else has any information about that, I would love to hear from other commissioners too.
Serafina Chavez?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. From the research that I've done, it seems that this commission was called for through Healing Justice Santa Barbara. And so that was, again, after the year 2020. They had been calling for that. It was a few of those activists, and they had really asked city council to create this oversight commission to develop oversight. So if we want to add something in that, I think that could be really great to give credit to our community, and especially to that amazing, amazing group that has been working really hard in the city of Santa Barbara. So if we want to add something acknowledging their efforts to create this, I think that could provide some context. But yeah, I also really do enjoy the wording. This is proactively establishing accountability measures. And again, I appreciate all of the comments that we got from the community, and I think hopefully that answers their question of why this is needed. It's a proactive measure. So yeah, thank you.
Rich Sander?
Yeah, I wrote down some of my response, so I may be reading a bit. But one thing that was also from the Chief Malekian's report is that the police department also feels that this was coming from a strong example coming from the national narrative. And so I wanted to talk about that a bit. And this goes into a little bit of what has been stated. The Santa Barbara Police Department has stated that the department averages around 20 complaints a year. And I want to say that while that is not even close to what we considered poor performance on a national level, I do not believe that this negates anything of what we've presented here. So I've said from the beginning, even my interview to be on this commission, that I wanted to create something that would serve as a leading model for other cities to implement. So while the department has received a minimal amount of complaints, in our public survey, it was also noted that very few people in the community know about the complaint process and/or what happens when complaints are received. So I believe that the Santa Barbara Police Department have monitored themselves well, and if we take these complaints at face values, they are acting in an exemplary manner. But it is not in any form of best practice for an institution like the police department to monitor themselves. I've been in faith communities, I've run a nonprofit, and in both of those institutions, there are checks and balances outside the organization that monitor the health of the agency as well as hold it accountable to best practices. As we've said before, we are not responding to an overwhelming number of complaints or bad practices of the Santa Barbara Police Department. Rather, we are creating a safe and healthy system of accountability where SBPD can be held to the same standard of best practices we hold other institutions to, and in so doing, they garner more and more of the public trust. Honestly, this entire process should be seen as a win-win for both the police department and the community. So I agree that we should frame this narrative as such. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian Alonso?
Yeah, so I think if the discussion is about the rationale, and I agree that we've heard that feedback from a couple of different sources. So we, in the white paper provided by the police department, it was specifically noted that we failed to justify in the introduction or in the reasoning for the model that we're proposing in these recommendations, why this model, why is this model justified, right? And I think the second source of information where we heard rationale is from the survey, right? The community was saying, hey, put some more data in here to say why this model and why now. So what I want to get at is how we should approach putting that justification. Like, what form should that take? Because I think in the spirit of collaborating with the police department and in the work that we've done together, and in the agreement that we share that oversight overall is a benefit to the community. We have survey data from the community, although acknowledging the limitations of the survey, that overwhelmingly supports the model as proposed as increasing trust, transparency, and accountability for the police department. I just want to know like, how should we frame this, right? So in the spirit of collaboration, I think it would make sense to frame it that way, right? To say that, you know, we took survey data from the community, and the police department agrees. But I do want feedback on this specifically from the police department, because I think if the position is that you don't support the model as proposed, or the chief has taken a position that you don't support the model as proposed, that would sort of, we would have to temper how we frame that in the introduction of the police department agrees with oversight, but not necessarily this model. And then the other thing that I am hesitant in the spirit of collaboration to talk about when you talk about justifying the need for police oversight for the Santa Barbara Police Department specifically, there is a record of settlements by the city, paid for by the taxpayers, for issues involving the police department over the last couple of years. And I think that we're talking about justification. I think oversight generally, I think it's a small investment to make to avoid the kind of settlements that we've seen in recent years, and generally in the trend with national police departments paying out increasing numbers of settlements to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. I want to stay away from that because I don't believe that that's in the spirit of collaboration, but I would love to hear from the police department on what form or justification this can take, or this section can take in the introduction, and specifically going to the chief's specific criticisms about there not being justification for the model. It was really long.
Sean, and then, or Rachel, did you want to add anything before we go to Sean?
Well, if I may, I just want to, because I want to clarify, I feel like those are all very important parts and important discussion, but I also am curious maybe from a process standpoint, like if we're discussing our introduction, I'm not sure how, right, like if, obviously, yes, we want to reflect the collaboration, especially with the police department, but I feel like this introduction section is the history of us as a community formation commission, and I don't know if there's needs to be a place in this paragraph of whether or not the police department supports or doesn't support what's about to come. Just in the sense that, right, like, we're trying to tell our own history, I think, here, and the responses are gonna certainly come later when we, you know, when we take into account the survey. And to me, the white paper from the chief and all the input we've taken from the police department is certainly part of that, right? That is collective feedback that we are all taking into account. So I absolutely want to let Lieutenant Hill have a chance to respond to that, but I also want to keep us focused on like what we're trying to write here, which I don't know if we need to start with like an apology of oversight in general, right? Like that's not the history of us as a formation commission at this point, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that. And then Lieutenant Hill, if you want to say a few words.
I will do my best to navigate both of those comments and concerns, and I appreciate the opportunity. I won't be able to speak to the settlements. Perhaps if you'd like to, we can discuss that when the commission feels like it's appropriate tonight. However, I think 3 points that were made by commissioners appear to be appropriate and the department appreciates and acknowledges, and that is the fact that it's proactive, the fact that this wasn't as a result of a specific incident in Santa Barbara, and that it does serve both the police and the public's best interest.
Thank you, Lieutenant Hill. Lizzie Rodriguez.
Controls, so that might be why his is on and I want to speak. But I think there's been some really good points shared thus far, and as mentioned before, there wasn't a specific event. This was a response to a national call, and it is supported by 21st Century Policing. over the years, there have been a number of efforts towards some form of reform of, or readjustment of policing. So I think all of those statements are true, and perhaps there's a way to incorporate all of that into the introduction, highlighting that it is a form of accountability, and also highlighting that this is a proactive approach. So I don't know that one is more of a priority than others, but it's clear that all of those are true.
Thank you. Other commissioner input? Kami?
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you all for all of that valuable input. We will take all of that and see what we can do to incorporate as much of that as possible, because it sounds to me as if all of you agree that there needs to be some additional language there that really gets to the heart of the reasoning behind the recommendations. I'm going to move on to the next section that was brought up by some of you, and that is, if we go to the section that's on the community formation, I'm sorry, the Civilian Oversight Board, down to section B, under composition, qualifications, and disqualifications for membership. Specifically, one of the commissioners would like to speak about the review board and the proposed number of at-large members and alternates. Now open it up the floor for discussion about possible changes to that.
Louisa Wood?
Yes, thank you. So quite a bit of the community feedback showed that the current number, I believe, is 11 plus 2 is, again, I'm going to take this off, is 11 plus 2. Many of the community feel that that is too large. And I wonder if we have a discussion about that particular subject. And I don't know, I would like to offer my personal opinion of 7 plus 2. I believe 5 is too small. I believe, having being on another commission, it's small, and we want to make sure that people are present and are able to take part. So that is something I would like to talk about as a commission.
Thank you. Christian Alonso?
Thanks. I've raised the issue before. I think that if you look at the number 11, that is larger than any commission we have at the city, I believe. I'd have to do some more research on that, but it's bigger than any commission that I'm aware of. So ours notwithstanding, right? But I think our mission is, like, that's one thing that I've tried to, like, balance as well, is that our mission is different than what the oversight's mission will be. And so in the past, when I've raised the issue, other commissioners have pushed back, saying that there are concerns that if we reduce the number, that it puts our ability to meet the mandate for diversity and to have a good representation of the community on the commission. And so I just would offer for anyone who still feels that way to say their piece, because I think it's important to consider. Do we feel like 7 plus 2, which is a number that I would support, is going to jeopardize the ability for us to have, and by 7 plus 2, I assume you mean 7 plus 2 alternates as outlined in the composition. So anyone have anything to say about meeting the diversity requirements?
Rachel Johnson?
Yes, I definitely have been, I think that was me making that argument the last time. And it is true. I mean, the next paragraph has a lot of things that we really want to see represented. And I do think that, you know, we've been kind of proud of ourselves and proud of the council for putting us in place, because this is certainly one of the most diverse across the board commissions that Santa Barbara has had, I think. So yes, that was sort of all in the spirit of that. And My take, I'm actually also, I would support decreasing the number, if that's what the commission wants to go with. And the reason main for that is I think actually the reason that I'm going to come down to making decisions on in a lot of this is that ultimately, we are making the best possible recommendation that we can as a commission. But once that recommendation is done, the city council is going to make all of these decisions. They are going to take the applications, they are going to look at this recommendation, which has, tons of different diversity, categories that we think are important to consider. But ultimately, that decision's out of our hands. So I'm happy to support that. We put our best recommendations, our best intentions, and our best guidance for council in this recommendation, but ultimately, there are other elements we will also have to let go of in terms of how those decisions are implemented ultimately. So I will end up supporting a lower number if that's what folks are interested in.
If you had to reduce it, like, what would your number be?
I mean, it's tough. I mean, I think 7 + 2, like a total of 9 feels reasonable. I've definitely heard other commissions talk about how if it's 5 + 2, sometimes they still struggle to get 4 to show up. And I think that is a concern. We haven't even gotten to all the duties and responsibilities, but there are a lot of tasks this particular commission is going to do. Workload-wise, I feel like it might be a little more intense than other commissions. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like I'd be considering things like 7 + 2 or 9 + 2.
Serafina Chavez?
I think I would also support either 7 or 9. I'm leaning towards 9 just because there is a lot of training, especially in the first year. But I think whatever number we choose, whether it is 7 or 9, or if we choose to keep it at 11, again, it is in the hands of city council. But I also trust that. I really trust that what we've put here, that they'll respect that, and I think they'll try their best to make it as diverse as they can. But yeah, I think either 7 or 9 is a good number to go with. Thank you.
Thank you. Lizzie Rodriguez?
I wonder if we could just pin this for a moment, because I think it really is going to be dependent on how much responsibility the COB is going to have. If it's going to be a working group, it would be best to have a larger number, not large like 11, but larger like 9. If it's an advisory group or one that's not going to do a lot of work groups, then it seems reasonable to do 7. I'm on a commission of 5, and 5 is definitely, well, in the past, it hasn't been too difficult, but this year is proving difficult to reach a quorum, so I would encourage more than 5.
Thank you. We have Louis Renault here. Good evening. Any other commissioner comments as it pertains to the number of Civilian Oversight Board members? Jordan Killebrew?
Everyone. I am also in favor of reducing, but I do think it is contingent upon other things that we decide and the rest of the recommendation.
Perfect. Go ahead, Cami.
I was just going to say, is there anyone that has a problem with putting a pin in this and moving on to the next section and coming back to this after we're done with the rest of the Civilian Oversight Board sections?
Nope, doesn't look like it.
Okay, then let's go ahead and move on to the next. And then we can definitely come back to that. So the next below is the issue of no member of the board shall have ever worked as a sworn law enforcement officer. So I'll open that up for discussion.
Commissioner comments? Rich Sander?
So I've written a lot on this topic, so I'd like to ask that you bear with me as we go through this. So A healthy system of accountability should try as much as possible to not be seen as holding any impropriety. The public agrees with this, as shown in the overwhelming response to the question of not having family members on this commission. So I want to say very clearly that I believe that police experience has value and provides a needed perspective to this board. Police, by nature of the institution, have a shared view of perspective. We've seen it many times in these meetings where Chief Malekian or Lieutenant Hill will say something to the effect of the view of the department is, or the department's perspective is. They represent a collected view of the institution they serve. Further, I know that these events of this past year on a national level have changed public perception of police. However, I believe that the police and the military are seen by a majority in the community as having an honored position or role. Yes, they make arrests, but they also protect and serve the community. And with that, there is innate honor that is bestowed to people in the position. On some level, I agree and I understand that. They're putting their lives on the line to protect our community. But the flip side of that is that there is a weight and gravitas that is awarded to their perspective just by nature of being police. Even in here, when Chief Malekian, Lieutenant Hill, and Lewis speak, I weigh it more in my mind. I don't believe that's just something innate in me. I think it's a part of our society as a whole. The reason we have chosen inclusivity to this board was to allow perspectives that are often not heard and often marginalized by police systems and practices to have a voice. The police department does not need their voice raised, as the police department point of view and perspective is not the one that is being silenced or marginalized in any way in this forum. Frankly, I take a bit of offense to the argument that to be completely inclusive, we need to include the very perspective that the board is specifically charged to hold accountable. Honestly, one could argue that the police already have an unfair advantage, as they are the only ones currently that have a guaranteed presence on the board, with an active, acting liaison, as Lieutenant Hill is to us. It is a guarantee, despite the makeup of the board. So, Lewis, I wanted to address something that you said in the last meeting. I had to leave early. I never wanted to put you on the outs, and it was never my intention to make you feel that you didn't have something valuable to contribute to this commission. So I am sorry for that. You do, and I am glad that you are here. And this commission isn't charged with police oversight. This commission is charged with creating the healthiest accountability system for our community that we can. To do so, I firmly believe that the board necessitates complete independence from law enforcement. The police have their own best practices, rules, systems of regulations, and perspective. This board is to provide a community perspective to weigh in on those practices and actions of the Santa Barbara Police Department. The liaison role already gives that perspective to the board. And while there may be voices such as Lewis that will be missed due to that, with no disrespect to Lewis, other retired police, or the Santa Barbara Police Department, I think that perspective is already weighted very heavily in our current proposal. So I'd ask that we consider that before we remove or change this position. Thank you.
Thank you. Other commissioner comments? Christian Alonso?
So I think the one thing that has changed about this debate, because it is one that we have had at length multiple times, and that we have not been close on, right? Or that we've been extremely close on, extremely close. So like, 49-51, is that we now have survey data from 1,100 community members that show support for having law enforcement, former law enforcement, have some kind of a role in or on the Civilian Oversight Board. And so I think what we set out to do here with the survey was to gather more data, right? And to tweak the proposal based on that feedback from the community. And I think that we've talked at length about how, we've been anxiously awaiting the survey data, right, which is now available to the public. to have that enhance our recommendations, our ultimate recommendations with feedback from the community. So I think that that's a really important data point to consider. Now, we do have to acknowledge the limitations of, and I say this a lot, but I think it's important because I think this 1,100 people in a month is a incredible, work by our partners and by the survey committee to get that much feedback in that short amount of time. But it wasn't available in languages other than English and Spanish. It was 55% white. I think 45% folks who identified as female in the survey results, and a number of other limitations with the data. But when we look at the specific question, is there a role for a law enforcement official to be considered for a seat on the COB? We saw 61% in favor, with a large percentage of those saying there needs to be some kind of limitation. So we talked with
Christian,
John.
if I can, just to clarify, that was, the survey question was for individuals who had previous law enforcement experience, not current law enforcement, correct?
Yes, yes. So I think that, we've heard from the department on this issue. We've heard from folks like Lewis, who has law enforcement experience. We talked at length in our last meeting about what would be an appropriate set of criteria. That conversation focused pretty extensively on the number of years that you would spend outside of law enforcement. Lewis says 10. The survey data seems to indicate support, broad support, 43% or 42%, someone correct me if I'm wrong, for 5 years, but the overwhelming majority for 5 years plus. So those are the data points that we've had. We've talked about how it's kind of arbitrary, right? But Lewis also gave some interesting testimony in our last meeting that I thought was interesting about needing some time away from the profession to participate fully and objectively in the process. And so that's kind of what I wanted to discuss with the commission tonight, is if we don't build this compromise and set the criteria and put it in the recommendations, my fear is that the city council or someone else will. And so if the compromise is law enforcement participation on the Civilian Oversight Board, the question for me then is, what does it look like and what is the criteria? So we've talked about the years at length, but I wanted to hear from some of the other commissioners on some of the other criteria. We've heard from the police department that there is support for no current or former law enforcement from the Santa Barbara Police Department. We've heard, and in the initial recommendations that we put together, our subcommittee group had concerns about overlapping jurisdictions, so the sheriffs, the Santa Barbara County sheriffs, CHP officers, right, that operate in the community, collaborating jurisdictions, right, so I'm thinking Ventura, San Luis Obispo County, bordering counties, and again, that year. So I'd love to hear from other folks if there's criteria that would make you comfortable with inclusion of law enforcement, former law enforcement, on the Civilian Oversight Board.
Jordan Kilbra.
Thank you. Actually, quick question for Lieutenant Hill. Is the position of the Santa Barbara Police Department, I believe it was Santa Barbara County, no former law enforcement for Santa Barbara County was in that compromise?
I know that was a discussion that was had, and I think that was reasonable. I can say very strongly that it would be no one from our specific department, but it seems reasonable, like Commissioner Alonso pointed out, that there are some close-by overlapping agencies that might be relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. You all have heard me talk about it. It's hard for me to fathom that a civilian oversight board, one that is essentially, overseeing the police, to have a police presence or law enforcement presence on there. And I do think, Louis, yes, your input is valuable, but it's still really, really hard because if I'm audited, I don't get to be on an auditing board to audit myself. And that's just how this feels. But I understand, I see the writings on the wall, I see what's coming down the pipeline. And for me, I would feel comfortable if at least 10 years and then no law enforcement from Santa Barbara County just because of that overlap. That seems fair to me, more than fair. I think that's a huge compromise that we're making, but I do see what's coming down, so my 2 cents.
Jordan, if I could ask your feedback on one aspect is, would you support limiting the number of seats on the board to 1?
One.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that clarifying point.
Louisa?
Thank you, everyone. I just want to start off by saying I'm very proud of the process that we have done this year. I think that we have worked very hard to get here. I think that we have worked very hard together to get here. I do believe that the community feedback has been extremely informative. And while it is hard, because I believe in independence, I also understand that the community has spoken. And I agree that we need to be inclusive. I agree that I'm at least 7 years out of retirement, 7 to 10, but I'm good with 7. I believe 1 position to be available for someone with previous law enforcement. And again, I do see the value of individuals who have law enforcement experience to give us feedback, to give not us, the future commission feedback and information about something that the rest of the commissioners may not understand. I also believe that, what did I say, 1, and limiting it to anyone outside of SB County. I would be comfortable with that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rachel and then Rich?
Thank you. Yeah, I want to say a couple things. First of all, I want to thank Commissioner Sander and uplift a lot of what he said. Listening to you talk, that is exactly, all of those things that I've thought through so much. And I think a lot of our values early in this process, I was reminded of those in that, and so I really thank you. This was a tough one. Like, we've done a straw vote on this twice. I personally voted different ways in those 2 votes. I do think the survey responses were really interesting. One of the things I took away the most was actually my own understanding being broadened in terms of why we would even ask a question about family of law enforcement, because I thought that was interesting, that the overwhelming support for the inclusion of folks with lived experience in law enforcement was the opposite for family members. And just so the public can hear, we talked about it at our last meeting, but our survey consultant, some of the feedback we got with that was that family members often can represent the bias without the actual lived experience and the expertise that comes with that. And I do think, so much of this learning process, I have been challenged with the way I think. And one of the things I also wanted to point out that I was thinking about when Rich was talking, and it's a counterpoint, I'm not bringing it up to be argumentative, but one of the other things I learned was that, there are lots of instances in municipalities where oversight boards with only civilians actually tend to support lighter discipline and lighter I don't want to say a heavier, support a heavier hand or a lighter hand, but there is also research about how that works, that having that voice can be really interesting because that perspective of lived experience with the distance of time. And I do think that, that the time is the piece that could convince me. And I really think it is important to continue to emphasize for anyone that would be critical of those who are supporting no law enforcement representative at all, that it is true that the SBPD will have very much a voice on this commission, right? We will have a liaison. The SBPD, I think, will be very well represented. And that said, I have had a great time this year, a really challenging time, but really beneficial, learning from law enforcement like Lieutenant Hill and folks that I've interacted with. But I also feel like it's important to say that that is very much from a place of privilege where being around law enforcement is not triggering. It doesn't bring up trauma for me, and it does for a lot of folks. So I think all of that makes it a messy, complicated decision that we have to make. I do think that this is an important point that, as commissioners have pointed out, council might decide for us, regardless of how we decide as a commission. So I think if that's the direction we're moving, I would definitely support at least 7 years. I mean, 7 to 10, I don't know if 7+ is sufficient. That feels like a long time, specifying that is only if it is also outside of Santa Barbara County. I like that addition, definitely. I think, there are a lot of hairs that we could split with, like, is Ventura County also close enough where, that's a thing. We also have a lot of law enforcement in SPPD that commute in from other counties. So potentially they would be excluded because of that service, but there's that. So I think if we're really specific, again, this goes back to the same thing. Ultimately, council is the one going to select the COB members. So if we limit it to one position out of 7 or 9, with those restrictions, I could move in the direction of being more comfortable with that.
Thank you. Rich Sander and then Lizzie Rodriguez.
So again, taking into account the survey, I think that we really need to look at those two questions. The first one being, do you support law enforcement? And then it was yes because of the lived experience. And then do you support family members? And it was no because of the impropriety, right? So because of that, it makes me think that the public values some form of lived experience. What the public didn't know or wasn't aware of in that question was that there was a assigned liaison from the police department in the board meetings. It's not a voting member, but they will provide all the lived experience that is needed to the board. So I'm kind of at a loss here, and I don't mean to be frustrated, but I don't understand truly what lived experience would show from a retired police officer than the liaison that's actually sitting there on the board. And if someone can explain that to me and help me understand why, otherwise it feels like we are overly allowing police presence on this board that is strictly for accountability of the police. Thank you.
Lizzie?
So this topic has been the cause of much debate and dynamic conversations both on this commission and in the community. We were split vote every time we discussed this. It was a pretty tight vote, and we discussed wanting to hear and looking forward to hearing what the community had to say. And what they said is that 65% indicated they would like to see former law enforcement on the board, with an additional 8% unsure. And for clarification, 68% of the community said they would not support immediate family of current law enforcement, as opposed to immediate family of former law enforcement. through this process, I've referred back to NACOL's 13 Principles of Effective Oversight of Law Enforcement to help guide my considerations. 3 of those 13 include independence, and it describes independence as independent of influence, not exclusive independent of law enforcement. Full cooperation is another important principle, which would be achieved through having law enforcement involvement on the board in addition to liaison. And that would be because you get, the department and the union would trust the results more. Procedural justice is another one of the principles which would be achieved if there's former law enforcement involved. Because as a civilian, I don't know what I don't know. And even through this process, we made some errors because we assumed that we knew something, and then getting professional opinion, we realized that some of our recommendations early on were not achievable. In regards to the time frame or absence away from law enforcement employment, to me personally, I don't have a strong opinion either way. It feels arbitrary, because what's most important to me is that the person who's applying shows or demonstrates objectivity and the ability to balance information and judgment. On another commission that I'm on, we have found it very, very helpful to have former police and former fire personnel to help even just ask questions that we wouldn't have known to ask.
Thank you. Rich?
So if there was a liaison from the fire or police department at those commission meetings, wouldn't that suffice for that kind of information that you would request?
If you're asking me personally, no, because there's the role that liaison plays as an employee of the police department. They are representing SVPD. A person on the board with previous experience is representing themselves. So they're not going to be in defense of or speaking on behalf of a department. They're going to be speaking on behalf of themselves. And again, if it's 7, it's 1 of 7. If it's 9, it's 1 of 9. So that person, whether it's 1 or 2 or how many people are allowed, it's a small number of vote compared to the entire commission. I think that the main point, though, is that if you have somebody who is employed by the police department serving as a liaison, that's a very specific role that they are playing on behalf of, where an individual on a commission doesn't have that obligation.
Rich?
I understand that, but even in that scenario, you are valuing the personal experience of someone that, as a community member, not the fact that they were a police officer. Because the lived experience of a police officer would be any questions that would be had, any things that about police systems, accountability, discipline, could all be answered by the liaison. So I don't understand what specific lived experience that person brings, other than creating an unsafe dynamic in that group. And I just, again, like I still am waiting for concrete reasons why lived experience for police department is so valuable in this that we would devote a seat to it or make it allowed versus just having a liaison that is literally written into the proposal.
Rachel?
It's already on. Okay, this is a follow-up question, and again, I'm not meaning to be argumentative, I'm really interested to see where this conversation goes, because I'm still figuring it out. So what I mentioned earlier about the fact that there are jurisdictions who have found that civilian-only boards, like without former law enforcement presence, tend to favor lighter discipline, a lighter hand, sort of less involved, and that could be for any number of reasons. But I'm wondering about the experience of someone who themselves maybe was a police officer, sworn law enforcement officer many years ago, who were themselves targeted or were themselves whistleblowers, or, right, like worked, because we hear those stories a lot. They're lauded and celebrated in, you know, the public discourse of like, I was this cop 20 years ago who saw how bad things were, and I tried to say something and I was pushed out. Like that, and maybe that is influenced by pop culture and things like that, but when you ask that question, that's where my mind goes. And that correlates to me why maybe jurisdictions today are finding that the people who, you know, are learning as they go with this or on these new boards don't always know how to look at discipline or how to make those decisions if they're being asked to.
Serafina Chavez.
I just want to remind everybody that the police department will still be able to make public comments as well. So even though they will have a liaison, they can still come as members of the public on off hours and make a public comment. So I'm kind of leaning towards still understanding this as Rich is, because I'm just not entirely convinced yet of what that specific value is. And I'm really, really working hard on thinking it, and I just want to thank you all for this wonderful conversation. It's been really challenging, but good. But I also think too, like if they still have a voice through the liaison, and they're still able to make public comment. And when they make public comment, there could be repercussions, there could not be, but that's a way for them to have a voice as a civilian when they're not on duty. Just like the rest of us. Anybody can come in here and give public comment and say, hey, future board, I think you're really missing this point. Or they can have a family member do it. The board can also take anonymous complaints from police officers, so they can still give they can still comment and give feedback that way. So I'm just, I'm really, really sitting with this one. But yeah, that's it.
And for clarification, the anonymous complaints, it refers to police misconduct. So as long as it's related to police misconduct. Kim Johnson?
Yeah, hopefully the amount of time, energy, and discussion that we've devoted to this proves to people who may be in doubt that this is something that we really take seriously and that we are trying to work out. For me, how I look at it is I do acknowledge that during our discussions, we did say that we would heavily weight or consider what public response was to the survey. So in looking at those numbers, for me, although it's not my personal position, I would say that I would devote or allow one position for someone who is former law enforcement. I like the idea of, again, one position outside of Santa Barbara County. And in regard to the time frame, you know, if you look at the numbers, 66% of the people who said yes, as long as they'd been away from their position, 66% said 5 years or more. So I think 5 years or 10 years, as has been discussed, I think is appropriate. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Other commissioner comments? Christian Alonso?
So I'm sort of curious about where the notion has come from that this is a devoted or guaranteed position for a person with lived experience in law enforcement has come from, because I don't think that any of the draft proposals that we've put together have said one seat must be set aside. I think that what we're saying at the top of this discussion is that the reason why, if law enforcement is allowed to participate on the COB, the reason why there has to be a criteria is because we're talking about oversight of something they've been involved in, right? Either current or former, or in this case, former. and there needing to be necessary safeguards to protect the objectivity and independence of the board. And so I don't think what's being discussed here, outside of some recent comments, is a devoted, guaranteed position. What's being discussed is the ability for participation, but with a specific set of criteria, which I'll again list: one position, 5 to 10 years outside of law enforcement. I'm still baffled by like what constitutes a good number of years, but no involvement with police, law enforcement in the county of Santa Barbara, and coordinating jurisdictions. And something I haven't heard us talk about, because we've seen this, and this not in the same way, but, and then you've all heard me say this again, but to me, this is like the nightmare thing of unintended consequences if we don't put it in the recommendations and it doesn't make it into the ordinance, is what happened in South Bend, Indiana, where a person was chosen, appointed by the city council to serve as the director of that office of police oversight, so it's a different situation, but who had a history of misconduct as it came out later, which caused, for lack of a better way to say this, like a not good outcome. So I think that those are the things that I'm trying to consider, and that ultimately the decision on composition and the mandate for diversity of experience on the board, no matter what we do, must come from the city council, right? Ultimately will come from the city council because they have to interview the folks, hopefully in a way that's as exciting as when we were interviewed for this, right? Which is a lot of participants, a lot of people coming forward, and a diverse pool of applicants coming forward to fill those spots. And so that's kind of where I'm at with it. And then I just really quickly, because I think I've heard understanding, right? Well, like, what are the reasons? Like, and I think that without, putting you on the spot, Louis, I would love to hear your testimony about some of the reasons why lived law enforcement experience could be beneficial to the deliberations, because I've heard a lot, again and again, and your testimony has certainly had an impact on the way that I'm thinking about this. Like, what are the things from your experience that would help folks navigate these conversations on a board like this, if you wouldn't mind?
Well, thanks again. I feel that you all heard a lot from me on Monday night, so I don't want to take up too much time tonight. And I appreciate everyone's comments. My first thing I'd like to say is I appreciate Rich's view and Jordan's, everybody's view tonight. My going backwards, when we initially talked about this, and I said my piece as a former peace officer in Oakland, we went to a quick vote, and that was that, and we got off. So my first thing was, I just wanted the right to be able to express whatever my experience is as a man of color, as a former peace officer, whatever it was, and just felt like wasn't able to do that. So that's neither here nor there. I'm not fighting for one side or another. I'm just sharing my thoughts on this. And whatever the vote is, I'm with it. I'm part of this team. At least I hope I am. So as far as my perspective, first of all, growing up in the inner city and having a lot of negative experiences that I don't think most people on this committee have had, like my brothers and I, like I mentioned Monday night, I became a police officer hoping I could change things. And obviously, I lost that battle, and I did it for 6 years and then left. And most of my life, I've been a citizen and been a black man. I've lived in Houston, Texas in the 3rd Ward. I lived in Oakland. I've lived in the inner city. So I get the plight. And from my perspective, if you talk about diversity and inclusion, that's what it should be. whether it's a country club, it's this committee, whatever, you know, I pretty much feel I've been the underdog all my life, so I come from that perspective of, you know, you can't do this, you can't be here, you can't do this. So I'm saying that, you know, that doesn't mean that someone from law enforcement is necessarily going to be in there. It's just allowing them the opportunity, if they get through the vetting process and earn the right to do that. So I don't necessarily, you know that I can justify reasons why they are. I know my perspective to a lot of the groups, subcommittees that I've served on has been, you know, I'm so much about police culture, and regardless of, you know, I know so many people who are on these committees like we are in other cities, and my comment to them, for most of them, and they say, you know, once the committee is formed, they're just voting whether to punish people or not, or whether it's unfounded or sustained or whatever, and they'd have no effect on the police culture, which is, if we're not working, and I said this, to build trust, and it looks to me like we've submitted a model where we want subpoenas, hypothetically, or, you know, we want to review everything that the police are doing. We want their trust, but we're not willing to trust. I just think this is a lot more about trust than I think we're willing to admit. And if I can't trust Sergeant Drayton or whoever's doing the internal affairs investigations to take a statement, to do a preliminary investigation, then we have bigger problems, in my opinion. And I think this is more about collaboration and trust. And I'm probably saying the same thing I said the other night, but that's my view on it. And from me, to you, Rich, it was just more about, I wanted to have say, and let's go to a vote. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember that meeting, but like, wow, I didn't really get to say anything, so that's why I pretty much didn't until Monday night. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Thank you, Louis.
Gabe,
Yes.
I'm sorry
Kami?
to interrupt. It's hard for me. I can't actually see any of your faces unless you are speaking. So I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anybody else who had not yet had a chance to speak that wishes to on this topic.
I have one question, but I know, Lizzie, you want to go. I have a question for John Doimus, if you're on.
Gabe, Chair Escobedo, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. My question pertains to a point that Christian had brought up regarding misconduct. Is there a way for us to include, whether it's, I don't know whether it would be legal for us to verify someone's misconduct if they were previously a law enforcement officer, but can we make them attest to the fact that they did not have a reoccurrent history of misconduct when they were a sworn law enforcement officer?
Sure. Commission Chair Escobedo, you could make them attest, and if they want to, they can voluntarily allow, for example, someone to review their personal record. I'll give an example. If someone wants to have a job with another agency, right? They usually give us, the people who are conducting the background for that agency, a waiver showing that officer has authorized them to look at their personal records. So as long as it's voluntary and consent, and if someone wants to do that, they can, and you can put that down, as a requirement that if you're former law enforcement, you would attest that, and also allow maybe one of the positions that we have there to verify that, as long as it's consensually given. If someone doesn't consensually give it, then you could, not include them if they don't follow that requirement. So hope that answers your question.
If the majority of the commission was supportive of that, would you be able to work with Cami to develop language for next Wednesday?
Absolutely.
Okay. Back to the commission, I'm curious if, from my fellow commissioners, if there is support for a clause like that, in addition to no more than one seat. It sounds like there's support for more than 7 years removed from law enforcement and outside of jurisdictions in Santa Barbara County. Would the commission be supportive of a clause or wording, as John Doimus had mentioned, about attesting to no reoccurrent history of misconduct and the voluntary access to those files for verification. Christian? And we are about an hour 15 in, so we might,
Yes, and then I think Vice Chair Zepeda had wanted to make a comment as well. But yeah, absolutely. I raised the issue. I think it would be an important clause to add.
thank you. Vice Chair?
Hello, I'll try to keep this short. So if I was just reading the survey and I didn't have any background on it, I wouldn't have been made aware of the liaison position that we have, right? And so I want to echo what Rich and Serafina were saying about how we do have that liaison for the commission where, again, they can provide experience on that, and we don't necessarily need to have somebody during the actual commission. And I know we keep talking about the survey and how this was a representation of our community, but our community isn't 55% white, it's not 45% female. So it's and while I was canvassing, trying to get folks to giving them the QR code, making sure that they took the survey, there was a wide amount that did not even feel comfortable completing that survey. And this was based on my own experience, and that's all I can speak on. And so if they weren't able to feel comfortable and confident to be able to complete a survey that was anonymous, that I had nothing to do with it, it's just here's the form, if you want to do it, cool, if not, then that's fine too. They didn't feel comfortable. How I put that into a perspective of how are they going to feel comfortable serving in a commission where there's going to be folks that have created that harm, which is the reason why we're here, and the reason why we're creating this. And like Serafina was mentioning, there is opportunity for law enforcement if they want to do public comment. There's going to be other avenues where we can build that trust long term, right? Maybe, yeah, we can build that long term. At the beginning, maybe we should just make sure that we have those avenues where people can feel comfortable and confident to be able to share or be able to hold that accountability piece that we keep talking about. If we just do it from the beginning, then it's how do we know, Even during this process, when we were trying to submit the complaint process, and I know I've brought this up before, there was no PDF form, there was no way for people to submit these complaints. And this is something that's been going on for years and years and years, It's the police department has had that opportunity to be able to accept those complaints, to be able to be hold themselves accountable. And as we saw from the website, as we saw and how the complaint process was being processed previously, there was a lot of speculation on how that was being done. So in order to move forward, we need, I personally would keep that liaison position for the police department if they would like to share, build that trust over time, continue to build that, continue to build that public comment. If they would like to provide that information, that's great, and then go from there. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Rich Sander?
I'll make this short. I think that we have spent a lot of time talking about this, and I just want to point out the amount of privilege that we're giving to police in this conversation, that we've made all of these exceptions to this one specific category of person to be on this board, when really the whole point of the board is to hold police accountable. So I just think that we should be aware of the discussion that we're making right now and showing that we're amplifying a voice that doesn't need to be amplified here.
Thank you.
Gabe, if there is no additional comments, or I don't want to cut anybody off, because I will say this is, I'm at the point where I feel very privileged to be part of this, or to be able to listen in on this conversation. It is very apparent, the amount of thought and energy and maybe a little toil too of coming to decisions on this topic. But I would suggest, since we do have several other sections to go over, that if there isn't anything that additional that someone would like to add, that we go to a straw poll so that we can either decide to make the change or leave it as is. Is there any opposition to that? Or any additional comments?
Can I just make a suggestion? Because I think I would like to see the language, like the specific language, and my understanding is that we're giving you like a set of directives to return with edits to be voted on at the next meeting when we review it in full. And so I would like to see the language before saying, let's vote on changing it to whatever.
Okay, then to be clear, if everyone is okay with that, the language that we would be creating would be based on what I heard when we were speaking of changes, what I heard the majority say who favor the change, that it would be a former member of law enforcement outside of Santa Barbara County who had been out of law enforcement for a period of no less than 5 years. But the range all of you kind of went back and forth between 5 and 10 years and 7 and 10 years. So I'm happy to create that language and bring it back to you if that is the language that you're looking for.
Cammie, I believe Kim Johnson wants to make a comment.
Yeah, so back to the idea of a straw poll, I would advocate for that so we can decide whether or not, like tonight, decide whether or not we're going to entertain the idea of building out a sort of a menu of how we will allow for this position, or if we're not even going to entertain that.
Louisa?
I'm in agreement with Kim Johnson. I think that we should, I think that voting tonight on this very specific topic is, so that we can move forward with language or not, is the right move.
Rachel?
Okay, so just a clarifying question. We're not voting on what language will ultimately be in it, but we're going to vote whether or not we want Cammie to write a second option for this point number 3 that includes this alternative proposal for, yes, limited to one position with all the things that Cammie just laid out. Is that right? That's what we're voting on?
It's my understanding that we're voting on whether or not to change it from what it currently exists to, I believe there was support for no more than one retired outside of Santa Barbara County, and then the number of years, it has varied from 5 to 10 years. And then I would add the additional clause of regarding records of misconduct as a law enforcement officer.
Okay, but Christian had asked that, or had said he wouldn't feel comfortable voting until he saw that language actually written out. So that's what I want to clarify. Are we voting to just be able to see that option in writing from Cammie? Or are you saying that we are voting on whether or not we want to make this change for real right now?
I think we don't have to agree on the exact language tonight, but it would be helpful to move forward with an understanding of whether or not we're going to preclude former law enforcement from being on the board, or if we are going to allow them in some limited capacity with some caveats and restrictions.
So you're asking for a vote, not a straw poll? I guess that's
No, a
right.
straw poll, but we're not voting to approve any specific language tonight. Cammie will go and come back with specific language, unless the commission feels otherwise. Cammie, was that your understanding as well?
Yes.
So, Cammy, can I get your help phrasing this in a question that we could use for a straw poll?
Yes, what we are asking people to participate in a straw poll for is whether or not they wish to include law enforcement on the board with the caveats or criteria discussed this evening.
Does everyone feel comfortable with that, voting on that in a straw poll? Sam, can we do a roll call vote, please?
Sure. Commissioner Alonso,
Yes.
Commissioner Chavez,
No.
Chair Escobedo,
Yes.
Commissioner Kim Johnson,
No.
Commissioner Rachel Johnson,
Can I abstain? Yeah, abstain.
Commissioner Killebrew,
No.
Commissioner Rodriguez,
Yes.
Commissioner Sander,
No.
Commissioner Wood,
I'm not exactly sure what I'm voting on. I'm sorry. I'm very confused as to I'm sorry. Can we take a step back for a minute and redo that? Because I don't understand exactly what's being voted on.
Cammy, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, the straw poll is on whether or not you would like to move forward with language that that would include the criteria for including law enforcement that was discussed tonight. It's not a vote on the specific criteria or the language itself, but on whether or not you want to include law enforcement with criteria and explore that, those options and language, or that you want to leave it as is. That's the other option. Is that helpful?
And it's former law enforcement, is that correct?
Correct. Based on the current conversation of this evening, the language that will come back to you will reflect, if you decide to go forward with exploring additional language, it would be former law enforcement. It would include information about outside of Santa Barbara County, and would also include criteria as to the number of years they've been away from law enforcement, as well as the attestation of regarding misconduct that was brought up as well.
Kim Johnson, did you have a question?
And Cammie, can you confirm what a yes would equal versus what a no would equal?
A yes is that we would go ahead and create the language for you to vote on next Wednesday. And also discuss next Wednesday, that we'd move forward with language that would include former law enforcement with additional criteria, that we would create that for you then to further discuss and vote on next Wednesday.
Do we want to restart the straw poll? Or do we want to just take it from Louisa? Anyone?
Lou, are you comfortable now with how it's outlined, or?
Yes, but I feel like we should start from the beginning.
Sam, can we restart the straw poll, please?
Sure. So with that being said, Commissioner Alonso,
Yes.
Commissioner Chavez,
No.
Chair Escobedo,
Yes.
Commissioner Kim Johnson,
No.
Commissioner Rachel Johnson,
Abstain?
Commissioner Killebrew,
No.
Commissioner Rodriguez,
Yes.
Commissioner Sander,
No.
Commissioner Wood,
Yes.
Vice Chair Zepeda,
No.
and Commissioner Reyno.
Yes.
Give me 1 second to tally that.
Even.
I believe it's even with 5 yeses, 5 nos, and 1 abstention.
Because it is even, unless the commission as a whole has a problem with it, I can go ahead and create some language that we can, so that people can see it based on the conversation, and we can continue discussion next week as well, particularly on this topic, or specifically on this topic.
I think that sounds great. Thank you, Cami.
Absolutely. Thank you again, everyone, for that conversation. I really appreciate it. Okay, the next section is a bit down. Bear with me. Is under stipends.
I'm sorry, can we take a quick 5-minute break? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So we're going to take a 5-minute recess. We will come back at 7:07.
Thank you.
calendar at 7:10. And Cammie, we will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. The next section that we're going to talk about, that one of the commissioners brought up, was in the area of stipends. So the original language stated that each board member is entitled to receive a stipend of $100 for each regular and special board meeting attended, and $20 per hour for each hour of training or community outreach event. It further states that the total stipend should not exceed $400 a month per member, and that the COB member stipends and the total monthly stipend paid may be periodically adjusted at the discretion of City Council. And that adjustments shall occur no more than once per fiscal year. So with that, I will open it up for any comments that people have about this section.
Go ahead, Louisa.
I feel like I'm talking a lot. This one is particularly hard for me as a single parent. Just this week alone, I'm spending over $400 on childcare so I can come to this commission meeting. And I believe, being here is extremely important for people such as myself who have lived experience as a family member and in our town. But the survey and the feedback was very mixed on this one. And a lot of the comments were, it should be commensurate. I don't really understand why this particular these commissioners would be paid more. I don't really get, do other commissions get paid? And so I thought that we should take a look at this section and discuss it as a commission, whether we should be looking at other commissions that get paid and how that works, and discuss childcare and how that works, because that was a comment that came up in the survey. Thank you.
John Doimus, I have a question for you. Okay.
Absolutely, Chair Escobedo.
John, can you remind us which commissions and boards in the city currently receive a stipend, how much the stipend is, and also a follow-up question is, are there any boards and commissions in the city that have required training other than?
From my recollection, and I can have it 100% accurate for our next meeting, but the HLC ABR, I believe, get $50, and the Single Family Design Board get $50 per meeting stipend for their meetings. I don't recall any other one, but just to be safe, I'll make sure it's down to those three commissions. And the trainings are just the Brown Act and the ethics, conflict of interest trainings, facility trainings they get. Now, one of the reasons why we have stipends for the boards that I mentioned too is the need to have professional licensed architects, et cetera, for their professional expertise in reviewing plans and everything else. It's really critical. So that's how that came about, of at least getting their time, getting the professional expertise, and why they're given a payment. So that's what I know. I'll confirm that throughout, but I know those boards having a stipend of that amount.
And John, one additional commission is the Planning Commission that does get a stipend, and there are no prerequisite skills in order to be on the Planning Commission. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. We had to mention the planning. Yes, it goes along with the community development commissions. Yes, the planning commission, and for that one, there's no prerequisite skills for that.
Okay, thank you. Rachel and then Lizzie.
Yeah, and there's also us, which also had no prerequisite certifications, things like that, and also getting the same stipend as 50. So though I, do not have the same experience as a lot of folks on this commission. I don't have kids. I don't have elders I care for. I really think it is such an important conversation for the city to have of how they support quote unquote volunteer labor. I definitely understand why community members would ask in the survey, be confused about why would this be any different. And so I think we do need to grapple with that. I think I would support, potentially if the commission wants to, decreasing our recommended stipend to what is currently given to these other commissions. I think that just makes sense to be commensurate with that. But I appreciate you bringing up the mandatory training, because we certainly went through the Brown and the ethics training as well. That makes sense that all commissions would do that. Given what is in the rest of our recommendations, I think what does make this eventual board special, what will make it special, is the immense amount of training that we have talked about and talked at length about how important it will be for folks who maybe come in with less experience, who are going to be asked to, make decisions and sort of review trends in a way that does require a lot of training. And that's not just knowledge training, that's training that the police department also supports requiring of folks that would be on this commission. So, things that allow them to really experience law enforcement's perspective as well. So I think if we are going to decrease our recommendation to be commensurate with other commissions, I think we should add something in there about that same stipend amount maybe being applied to additional trainings. So beyond Brown and ethics trainings, which if it's like ours, those would happen during a regular meeting anyway, I believe. So they'd get the meeting stipend for that. But if there are additional trainings, that those be treated like special meetings or something, so that that there would be additional stipends if there is additional training required.
Thank you. Lizzie?
I don't have a strong opinion about this either way, but if we do make a recommendation on this, I wonder if there's a secondary recommendation that the council evaluate their compensation policy and recommend that they really consider compensation for all their boards and commissions, especially with their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney Duemas, but I believe that the Fire and Police Commission required, as of last year, a training on the history of race and policing. Now, that's one required training as opposed to whatever number that this commission decides to do.
Chair Escobedo, Commissioner Rodriguez. No, you're correct. That was something we initiated 5-6 months ago. And we anticipated to be not yearly, I believe, but for new commissioners, if I recall correctly. So that is one, yes. There are many commissions, so there may be things here and there that might get missed. But overall, the three main trainings are your ethics, Brown Act, and conflict of interest training. But that is one we do have, correct.
Thank you, John. Rich?
I think that's a good idea from Commissioner Rodriguez. The idea that we make this equal to what other commissions receive, but with a recommendation about diversity and inclusion, I think would be wise, as well as something about childcare, which I think is, I don't know if we've talked about that yet, but I think would also be something that would be wise to make a recommendation to the council.
Jordan?
I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, so I think maybe we can agree on this and move forward.
Sounds good. Cammie, back to you.
Thank you. And just to make sure, Jordan, with that statement, what I am hearing is that this decreases to $50 or the amount currently paid to other boards, and with the secondary recommendation that council revisit their policies. Okay, thank you for that.
Jordan, did you want to add one more? Oh, I don't know if you were going to say something else. Sorry about that. Cammie, go ahead.
Okay. And then also, I did take notes on the comments that were made about including making sure that child and elder care was included in the recommendations as well. Okay, the next section.
Real quick, I'm sorry. I actually would say, because that's not included, I would vote to take that out and make it a recommendation as well. I don't know how the rest of the Community Formation Commission.
Was that for child and elder care?
Yeah, child and elder care, from my understanding, if we make that, is that the same as the rest of other commissions and boards, or no? So I would take that out and make it a recommendation as well.
Okay. Did you get that, Cammie?
So make it a recommendation of something that the city council considers in the future?
Considers for
'Cause it
all
is-
of their boards and commissions. Is that
Okay.
right?
Okay. Yes. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, the next section, so that is all of the comments that I received or requests for discussion on the Civilian Oversight Board portion of the recommendations. I'd like to move on to the auditor monitor element of the recommendations. Before we go back to the piece that we tabled earlier, so that we have a better understanding, I think some of this conversation may still feed into the conversation about the overall duties of the Civilian Oversight Board. So I'm going to start by a recommendation that I heard in conversation regarding the name of the Office of Police Oversight. So in conversations that happened on Monday, some feedback that was received, also conversations that came out of the meeting with the chief that you had last week. There was a suggestion about changing it from Office of Police Oversight to the Independent Police Monitor, so that it was very clear that it is not a department or new department, that it is a position. And so that was the first thing that was brought up, and I wanted to start the conversation there about changing that wording.
And if I may, that was a suggestion that I had submitted to Cami, because I've noticed quite a bit of confusion about what it is that we're recommending. And I think a lot of the comments that I had seen in the public outreach information that we had gotten from CCI, and just hearing folks talk about it, when they hear the Office of Police Oversight, I think in their imagination, they picture this big department, and so it seems like an overreach when that's the furthest thing from what our actual recommendation is. So instead of calling it the Office of Police Oversight, the suggestion was the creation of the position of Independent Police Monitor, so that they know that it's just a position instead of this whole new department that's going to demand all kinds of support. It's one position that would live in the city administrator's office. I think it tells the story a little bit better. It's a little more straightforward for folks, and it doesn't give the impression that this is a huge thing. It's a pretty reasonable request, in my opinion. Kim Johnson?
Yeah, I'm definitely in favor of changing the name. I wonder if Independent Police Monitor sort of sets that position up for failure, because, you know, if they're walking into a room and they're the police monitor, who wants to eat lunch with them? So, you know, we might want to bat around a few ideas, but definitely agree that the name should change.
Thank you. Cami, from your experience, are there other names that a position like this would be called?
It is called also Independent Police Auditor, which is actually also quite frequent. And they can, in the duties that they perform, are quite interchangeable. And I do appreciate Kim's comment about how that can sound. But there are both, you find both all throughout the civilian oversight world.
Rachel?
Yeah, I just want to, ask a question, I guess. Do we need to give it a name with capital letters? Does that have to be part of our recommendation? Because, to me, when I hear Independent Police Monitor, that to me is a position that we've talked about and learned about in different ways. But is it useful or required for us to name it for the city administrator and the council?
My only comment would be just, it's easier to reference in recommendation, if it has a formal name, but I'm not tied to anything formal. Thoughts from other commissioners? And, I mean, part of it is we don't really have to maybe come up with the exact name tonight. We could just maybe agree on whether or not to change the name. But Jordan?
That was a recommendation. If we agree to change the name, and then we can just put, you know, a name placement, and then identify that this can be assigned by city council or city administrator, city staff.
Lizzie?
So I'm wondering if we're limiting ourselves by saying, creating a position as opposed to creating a job description that when in practice may take one person, may take two people. So I don't know if you would call that an oversight entity with a list of things that that entity does. But I just wondered about the need for declaring a single position.
Thank you. Any thoughts about that? Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting point, because I do think that, I think that was our initial, thought process with thinking of it in terms of an office. An office is sort of this vague term, and what that would look like could be left up to council or future councils. I mean, I wonder, I know we have language in the recommendations right now about an initial evaluation period, and I'm wondering if that can be a place where we can maybe more productively work that out. My hesitation with making it too vague is that I definitely feel like the scope of work that we're looking at and things we've learned from other oversight professionals that we've learned from is that at minimum, a full-time position is required. So I would actually be more concerned with leaving it vague, that instead of them deciding 2 or 3 positions could do it, that they would decide no position, or, an existing position might be just given a few tasks and call it good. So I think in service of kind of honoring our task, which is to make the best possible recommendation at this point, recognizing that council and the city administrator are going to make other decisions that, implicate that later on, or affect that later on, that I'd feel more comfortable at least referencing one position, but I would certainly like to hear what other people think about that.
Thank you. And a thought occurred to me as you were discussing, and it reminded me another reason why I made the suggestion is in the feedback, there was a lot of confusion about the relationship between the board and the Office of Police Oversight. And I think naming it something like oversight entity might confuse it even further. So referencing a position and the relationship between that position and the board might clear up a lot of that confusion. Jordan?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Commissioner Rachel Johnson's saying. I think we should, make it one position for the time being. If it becomes too much work, that is then up to council, city staff, city administrator to whether hire more or expand however they deem fit. But I think we do need to be very clear because we are providing a recommendation.
Thank you. Other comments on this particular topic? Is there any opposition to changing the name of the Office of Police Oversight? I'm not seeing any. Okay, Cammie, back to you.
Thank you. So the next section, really almost the entire first paragraph, it was asked that we discuss this a little further. It currently states the Community Formation Commission recommends that an Office of Police Oversight, now to be changed, be created for the purpose of providing civilian oversight of the Santa Barbara Police Department and ensuring that SBPD is responsive to the needs of all members of the Santa Barbara community, thereby promoting and building public trust, transparency, and accountability. That it will be housed in the city administrator's office, working independently from, but collaboratively with SBPD. It will be managed by the director of police oversight, who will be responsible for ensuring that the duties of the OPO are fulfilled in consultation and collaboration with the Civilian Oversight Board. I'll open that up for anybody who would like to discuss possible changes to that section.
I think this was mine as well. Sorry, I'm trying to read my notes. I think the change that I had suggested was because this is one of the first sections that describes what this element does, the auditor monitor element, which I have a great deal of interest in. This is going to be the first portion of this element that people take away for an understanding of what this part of the oversight model does. And so I had suggested adding some language that describes some of the job duties as early as possible in that description so that people walk away with some understanding of what the office does. And some of the terms that I had suggested were that the city hire a civilian police monitor to review the handling of complaints, review trends in policing, recommend improvements to police practices, support the Civilian Oversight Board, and engage with the public. Those were specific duties that this particular part of the element will be in charge of, and I thought it was important to include those early on in the description of the element. What's that? Yeah. So the CFC recommends that if we change the name, but just excuse it for this portion, the Office of Police Oversight be created and that the city hire a civilian police monitor to review the handling of complaints, review trends in policing, recommend improvements to police practices, support the Civilian Oversight Board, and engage with the public. And that was the change. Any comment?
That sounds good to me. Approve that.
Rachel?
Yeah, I absolutely. When Cammie was reading the existing paragraph out loud, that I get why folks would be confused. It's lots of words without being super descriptive. So I really like the idea of having something more akin to a job summary. As Commissioner Rodriguez was saying, like a job description is often most useful for folks to really understand what someone would do. So if we can find a way to summarize that nicely, and that looks like a really great start to that, I'd love to see, that language fleshed out.
Any other comments? I'm not seeing any. Back to you, Cammie.
Okay, great. And then also the middle portion of the paragraph that's highlighted in pink, that is just highlighted because there was some confusion as to where this was housed in city government and the feedback we received from the surveys. So I just wanted to let you know that it is in here, and it is probably something that people just did not know about when they took the survey, that it did sit in here already. The next piece that was brought up by a commissioner is the potential to change the wording that the second paragraph of this section starts with. The OPO will encourage broad organizational change. I'll open that up for conversation.
Rachel?
I mean, I feel like we've had this conversation a lot lately. Like this is one of the instances where I just think some of the language assumes that broad change is needed. And I know, we've heard from a number of different, stakeholders that, that feels like it sets a really negative tone about what we have existing at this point. So, I mean, I think the rest of that sentence and section is really important to include, analyzing patterns and trends, recommending changes. So what goes on from that is part of the job description. And I think as long as it's clear that should that other work lead to, the need for any kind of change, that would be understood that that's part of this role. But I'm fine with kind of removing or, softening language that seems to assume that we're saying everything needs to change.
Thank you. Other comments from commissioners? Louisa?
I mean, I think, pardon me, I think overall, including terms like best practices, ensuring that this department is, engaging in best practices or something like that, and that I would like to see that kind of language there. Sorry.
Thank you. Any other comments on this portion? I'm not seeing it. Oh, Jordan?
So just a point of clarification, we're concerned about broad organizational change. What is the exact verbiage, if you can repeat that? Sorry. I just want clarity.
Of the language that we're changing? It is, I'll read the whole sentence. The OPO, the Office of Police Oversight, will encourage broad organizational change by analyzing patterns and trends, recommending changes in policies and procedures, promoting a positive community-centered culture within the department, and addressing systemic issues. And I think that the comment that was made is encourage broad organizational change, assumes that broad organizational change is needed. And I think I saw some comments in the survey that pointed to that language specifically.
Okay. So then the recommendation would be to change the OPO will encourage best practices? Because I think, okay. Would that make an assumption that the Santa Barbara Police Department's not doing best practices?
It's a fair point.
May I suggest just saying the Office of Police Oversight will, and then we take out encourage broad organizational change, and and just say will analyze patterns and trends, recommend changes in policies and procedures, promote a positive community-centered culture within the department, and address systemic issues.
Teamwork.
That works for me, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Back to you, Cami.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next section that was asked to be discussed is just later on in that paragraph. From the section we just talked about, it goes on to say it will work to monitor aspects of the SBPD, including but not limited to complaints, discipline, training, staffing and recruitment, use of force, approaches to crime prevention, and de-escalation strategies. The next section is specifically what they would like, it was what was requested to talk about. And that is, it will also issue recommendations regarding any aspects of the law enforcement agency that are within its purview.
I suggested this one. My recommendation was to add, it will also issue recommendations, comma, in collaboration with the COB, comma, regarding, just to show that there's a relationship in the recommendation process between this office or position and the COB. Jordan?
That makes sense to me. I think as a commission, it's implied, we already have that in our head, but to the public, they're probably like, what is this? So I think as many times as we can share that collaboration, I think that'd be really good.
Thank you. Other comments? Not seeing any. Kimmy?
Okay, just finishing the note here. Thank you. The next section falls under duties.
1 second,
and
Kimmy.
authority.
Sorry to interrupt. Rachel has a question.
Sorry, I just noticed something, if you can go back up to that other paragraph, just since we're kind of, wordsmithing a bit. The reviewing and the monitor of the overall complaint process, so that last sentence, fair, thorough, and complete, I would like to suggest adding the word accessible, because I think that's something that has come up repeatedly in the survey. So just since we're here, but maybe to also look for references to similar sentiments throughout the recommendations, that we think about adding, language of accessibility in there as well.
Thank you for that. Okay. Moving down to duties and authorities. So, this suggestion, so it is the first section of this is carrying out the day-to-day responsibilities of the Civilian Oversight Agency in a way that ensures procedural justice. So what was suggested actually came with a very long list of things. So I did copy that so that you could see that in the conversation. Can you see that new list by
No.
chance?
No, we can't.
Okay, just a moment. Let me reshare.
We can see it now.
Okay, great. So the suggestion was to change the language slightly in the section, but also to add each of these bullet points.
So again, this is one that I submitted in an effort, again, to clarify for the public as they read the recommendation about what this particular position will do. And it is somewhat similar to the items described in the opening paragraphs, but lays them out in pretty clear, easy to read terms for folks. And so I'll just read it. Receiving and processing complaints concerning police employees. Lizzie? Is it possible to zoom in, Kami?
Yeah, let me see what I can do for you.
And this came out of the memo that we had received and people talking about, and we've also heard comments about what will this position do? Will there be enough work? Is it necessary? And so I think laying out the job duties is helpful in describing that. The current language is carrying out the day-to-day responsibilities of the Civilian Oversight Agency in a way that ensures procedural justice. The suggested change is carrying out the day-to-day responsibilities of the Civilian Oversight Agency in a way that ensures procedural justice for all involved parties. These day-to-day responsibilities include, but are not limited to, receiving and processing complaints concerning police employees, monitoring the complaint investigation, recommending best practices to the Professional Standards Unit during the course of an investigation, performing ongoing analysis of complaint trends, recommending changes to police policy practices and training based on evidence-based effective practices, analyzing and verifying reporting trends and completed police employee disciplinary decisions, all with the goal of identifying changes that will improve police services to the community, working to enhance community relationships and build trust through community engagement opportunities, and other duties as directed by the Civilian Oversight Board. And I went back and watched Joey Lapari's meeting with us to pull some of these, and then also did some research to pull language that I thought fit with the rest of our recommendation. But I'm definitely not tied to any one thing. So if there are any comments from the commission. Kim?
Regarding the first bullet, wondering if sort of the comment that was mentioned earlier about people not having access to the complaint process, if a part of that could be ensuring that it's easy to access, et cetera, something along those lines.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think as many times as we can put that in there. Jordan?
This looks great. I'm always a fan of bullet points. I would say, from the survey, awareness of complaint process should be a part of this so that the community is aware that there is even a complaint process in addition to its accessibility.
Thank you. Lizzie and then Rachel.
I just need clarification on the purpose of oversight, or the complaint process, I believe is is for sworn officers. So I think the police employees might include non-sworn, and I think there's a different process for filing complaints for that. So if there could be clarification on that, otherwise I think it would need to be complaints alleging police misconduct. And then also, does monitoring the complaint investigation, is that clear? Because I don't think I know what that is. I think I have idea of what that is, but I think that might be interpreted depending on who's reading that.
Two questions, one to Lieutenant Hill. Is there a separate process for professional staff in the police department? for
There's
complaints?
not a separate process, although I will say it was my understanding that the purview and the recommendation was of police officers only, not professional staff. So using the term police employees would also include our professional staff. So if that's the case, the more accurate term might be concerning police officers.
I think the only reason I had included the term police employees is because we had an incident here in Santa Barbara not too long ago with a professional staff of the police department that alleged misconduct, but I'm not tied to that. So that was the thought behind having it as broad as that.
But that's the purview of the commission, but to answer your question, it is the same complaint process.
Thank you. And Cammie, is there a better way to, well, I guess maybe that's one of the things that we come back with next week is more clear language for monitoring the complaint investigation.
I can definitely work on some language that's clear, but in its most basic form, it really is about, I am assuming from this language, what that says to me is that it is just doing that, monitoring the process from receival to completion of investigation.
Correct. Kim Johnson?
Back to the conversation about the term police employees. I also was under the impression that our purview is with law enforcement officers, and that's how we develop the surveys. So I would suggest that we kind of stay in that space as opposed to broadening it out.
Fair enough. Rachel?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kim. I was thinking that when we were doing the survey, making sure our language was consistent of complaints of alleged police misconduct. So I would just say, let's try to keep our language as consistent as possible. One other comment that Jordan got me thinking about was, yes, do we want to elaborate any more about those community engagement opportunities? I feel like there's, right, we don't need to have an exhaustive list, but there are a lot of important elements that we've talked about for this role that I think kind of fall under that general category. And then my third, this is just more of a question, but since it's been brought up, to make sure that we really clarify the relationships of this role, the COB, and the city administrator. Should that last bullet point somehow involve the city administrator as well? Just so it doesn't imply that this position only reports to or is directed by that COB?
I think that's reasonable. Christian?
I'm sorry to return to the police employees conversation again, but I do think it's important that we not remove entirely the ability to process and review the internal complaint process, especially considering that there also have been recent high-profile and well-reported on instances of non-sworn complaints alleging conduct by non-sworn employees of the police department. And I think that it's important that we not lose that by keeping the focus exclusively on sworn police officers. Because as far as I understand, the surveys didn't say sworn or non-sworn, did they?
Commissioner Alonso, I don't think I can speak to this survey, but it is on page 5 in the recommendation that the purview is of sworn police officers.
And just as a clarification in terms of terminology, instead of non-sworn, it's professional staff. Any other comments on this? Suggested changes for Cami to develop language? I'm not seeing any. Cami, back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let me switch back to our other screen quickly.
Sorry, Cami, 1 second. Jordan has a question.
Yeah, Lieutenant Hill, if we keep it solely to sworn officers, does that create now another process for SPPD unsworn personnel?
Commissioner Kilber, you mean for professional staff?
Yeah,
The process
professional
would stay the same. There just wouldn't be the external oversight from the COB or the monitor.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. The next section takes us down to the section dealing with staffing. So there actually was, let me just preface this by saying that there really was the request to discuss this entire section. So starting with the CFC, therefore recommends that the city of Santa Barbara create 2 staff positions, but then also discussing the director of police oversight and the community ombuds. So I'd like to open it up for people who have thoughts about how this section should change from its current draft.
Louisa?
Okay, so there was overwhelming feedback in the survey and things that that have come back from the community about the cost of this commission. And I wonder if we as a commission, and one reason I'd like to discuss this further is just talking about this particular position and a little bit further. If this is something that can be folded into the director position or not, should we continue to keep this? So this is, anyway, this is a discussion that I wanted to bring up tonight. Thank you.
Christian?
Well, I would love to hear from the drafting subcommittee because I know a lot of work went into outlining and describing the role and the value of such a role, like more staff. So I would love to, before entertaining like cutting it, could we talk about the value and then maybe the thought process behind including it and then have that discussion?
So as a reminder, the way that we went about, we as in the full commission went about drafting these recommendations is we had a free-form brainstorm. And every idea or no idea was a bad idea. So we had included everything possible. And then the work groups made that into sentences. It's not until this process right now have we had the opportunity to remove all of those brainstorm ideas. So typically brainstorm includes everything and then we weed it down. This is our weeding down process. In the brainstorm, we never, to my recollection, we never said 2. That came as a recommendation from NACOL that we include 2 with the hopes that we at least get funding for 1. So in this process, I would like to recommend that we remove the second position. And I think that that would be probably more appropriate for our size and budget and probably better received by the council.
Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this ties in with the discussion we had earlier tonight about kind of the naming of the position and the vagueness, but wanting to keep it specific enough to require at least one. So I still want to reflect that and, you know, tie this section to that earlier mention where we're talking about the staffing in another section. I mean, I agree. I think the community ombuds was also sort of a point of confusion, I think, for some folks, like how to differentiate those duties. So, I mean, something I would recommend that we didn't get to in the list of duties that Gabe suggested in the other section, but are really important to keep are things like, you know, the ombuds will staff the Civilian Oversight Board. I assume then that we're meaning that other full-time position will take over that, as well as the next one of drafting an annual training schedule. I know training is something we've talked at length before about. We probably don't need to anymore, but just to make sure that that's in there, because that really was a key point earlier in conversations, was about how to determine actually what trainings would be mandatory and voluntary and different levels of that. So I would support just moving some of those key job description duties to the list of the independent monitor.
Thank you. Other comments on this section as it pertains to staffing? Rich?
I'd say, given the number of complaints received by the department, I really think that most of the process that the commission will be dealing with is going to be a set of attitudinal complaints, and then the auditor monitor is going to be analyzing trends more. And so I do think because of that, I don't necessarily see this second position there, and at least for where the current situation is, and hopefully never that it would get to a point where we need another person to meet those demands. So I would say that if we fold this into the director position, I think that would be our best bet.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out a question to the commission is, are there any thoughts about, Louisa brought up cost is one of the concerns that we've heard. It's something I've heard about bringing on a full-time position with a pension and it has other expenses that come along with it. Are there thoughts about suggesting a contracted position for this to start, to get through the evaluation period, which I think is 4 years or 5 years, 3 to 5 years, I forget what it is. As an attempt to mitigate costs as we recommend this to City Council.
Chair Escobedo, are you recommending that for the director position or for the ombuds position?
The director, so getting rid of the ombuds position, we would have the police monitor position, whatever we want to title it, and contracting for that position rather than recommending a full-time permanent staff with the city of Santa Barbara.
Then I'd say that I think we discussed contracting at different points, and I don't know where we landed on it, but my immediate thought is if it's a contracted position, does that mean that it would be within the city's budget permanently, so to speak? Or does a staff require that to make it a budget line item? Or can we, if it's a contracted position, does that still meet budgeting requirements?
It would still need to be budgeted for. It wouldn't have the same type of cost. So for permanent full-time staff, it would come with pension benefits that they would have to fund. It would come with healthcare costs. There are organizations and folks in the police oversight world that do police monitoring for jurisdictions on a contracted basis. So it tends to be cheaper for cities. It's not my preferred method, but if we're hearing the feedback about cost, that's one possible solution, is to incorporate that into our recommendation that the city of Santa Barbara contract with either an organization or an individual to provide that full-time police monitoring, support of the COB, all of the duties laid out right now in the Director of Police Oversight. Damo?
Thanks. I think that's a good idea. I just think it's important to be careful with the quality we attract from it.
Is your mic on?
Okay, go closer.
I apologize for interrupting. I can't hear you. Timo.
Can I speak up? Okay. All right. Sorry.
There we go.
All right. So I was just gonna say I thought it was a good idea. I just think that it's important to be cognizant of the quality we will attract. I don't really know. I'm not familiar with like the hiring process with contracting, but I do see that based on the experience with Denver, you know, you get to attract like a top person like that with all that skill set. We do have to have some like value to the position to attract them. So, especially for hinging like all the responsibilities on that role. So.
Great point. Rachel and then Lizzie.
Thank you for that point. That is a really great point, especially in a place like Santa Barbara, where attracting anybody to any job comes with a lot of issues because of where we are and the cost of living. And we've learned that's an issue even for our PD to live locally. And I think that's really important. I love a good budget discussion. Budgets are value statements. And I think Demo brings up a great point of what, you know, what would be signaled by a certain kind of budgetary choice. I also recognize, we've said this before tonight, but you know, ultimately that is something that's going to be in the purview of council to decide, right, and the city administrator to control the budget. So I think, again, we go back to what is our purview, and it's to make a recommendation that is the best possible one for Santa Barbara. So I think it's important to acknowledge that talking about it as a contractor or recommending that will make it more palatable, likely. But it still signals to the community that ultimately this is thought of, at least on some level, as a temporary situation. And I guess ultimately I'm, you know, I don't want to signal that to the community from the perspective of this commission or from myself personally. So I think that's what we probably need to grapple with, right? Is like, what are we putting forward to council? And then it is ultimately up to them what they will put forward with that sort of signaling of the value statement. So, yeah, I'd love to hear what other people think about that, because this is a struggle for me. Like, I've thought about this because budgetary critique and pushback is probably the primary one that our recommendations are going to receive.
Thank you. Christian and then Rich.
I agree with Commissioner Rachel Johnson and Commissioner Adam Malikian. I think that the argument to me is that this is an investment in best practices. This is an investment in effective oversight and standardization of data practices. And I think ultimately what my research and what analysis kind of demonstrates is that this, making an investment in a full-time position is cheaper ultimately than misconduct and settlements that are associated with misconduct. And so I would love to hear maybe from NACOL of some jurisdictions that you're aware of that are doing the contractor thing well, because I can't recall an example where they're contracting the services of the auditor monitor out. So so I would just love to hear so I can look into it more. But I think generally speaking, I'm leaning much more towards making an investment with the pension and other considerations, which I understand make it more expensive, with the understanding that an investment here is ultimately still cheaper than misconduct.
So Christian, in answer to your question, there are a couple of examples that come to mind immediately in California. Santa Cruz has had a contractor in that position for some time. And then there is a newer example, Santa Rosa, also. And I'm much more familiar with Santa Rosa in that they have a 3-year contract with a consultant to provide auditing and monitoring services as well as staffing for the board.
Cami, sorry, just real quick as well. Do you have like also a list of folks that provide these types of services that are reputable or that NACOL would recommend maybe?
I have a list of people, we try, because so many of these people are members, we tend not to recommend one over another, but I can tell you that there are quite a few people out there who are, they have years of oversight, professional oversight experience, who have taken on these positions. And then occasionally there are some that get these positions that might not have had previous oversight experience, but bring other things to the table. But I can tell you, for instance, Santa Rosa just hired a group who has been around for some time, who are one of the people who cities have been very satisfied with their services.
I believe John Doimus has his hand up and may have a comment about the contracted conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Escobedo. I just wanted to point out one thing for the commission. Yes, if we do hire a full-time employee, there comes with a PERS cost, as you all mentioned. But we also have to be careful too when we do a contractor. That's why a lot of times I think Santa Rosa is a good example. So I don't know too much about it, but you're contracting with a firm. And the reason I say that is a couple years ago in 2019, a state law was passed calling AB 5. And basically it determines whether a person's independent contractor or an employer or an organization. And there's a specific test, it's called the ABC test. And in order to be considered independent contractor, you have to have a yes to 3 qualities, right? 1, the worker is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity. So, which is kind of good for this, right? You want that, so that has to be a yes. The worker performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. And that would probably be the case here too. And the worker is customarily engaged in independently established trade, which would this be too. So, but generally it'd be easier at least to contract with a firm versus an individual to even ensure that they don't eventually become an employee. So that's just one important point I want to raise for the commission. Thank you for allowing me that time.
Thank you, John. Sorry to interrupt. Rich?
My only concern with making it a contracted position is, it does signal that there may be a time period for this position to end. And if we're folding the second position into the director position, a lot of those job description duties were monitoring the board, and I want the board always. Like, I don't want that to ever not be a part of police oversight. And I would worry what would happen if the contractor position went away, who would maintain the board and continue to keep that up. So I'm leaning more towards making it a staff position.
And yeah, thank you for that. If I'm being frank about my concern is that the city will point to a budgetary issue and completely disregard a professional police oversight professional and just have the civilian oversight board that would be staffed by current staff at the city. And in my opinion, I think that undermines a lot of our recommendation because it's going to be the police oversight professional that provides a lot of the independent context for the information that comes to the oversight board. So whether that's policies, procedures, recommendations, training, I think that it's really important for us to have a police oversight professional, and I really, really worry that the city will point to the cost burden of a full-time professional staff, permanent staff, and we'll really miss out on that key portion of the civilian oversight model. So that's the part that I'm struggling with, and I think, in my mind, one of the ways forward, and of course, whatever the full commission decides, but one of the ways forward is recommending a contracted position through the first evaluation so that it gives the city an opportunity and a decision point that's very clear for the community and clear for the city on, during that self-evaluation process, to decide whether or not they make that position a full-time permanent position, at the same time that they're also grappling with the decision of whether or not to change the charter and among other things. So that was my thought process. Lizzie?
So I would support a recommendation that would contract an experienced professional to help set up the, this entity, office, or position. As Cammie shared, there are organizations whose specialty is to do this, and individuals whose specialty is to do this. The City of Santa Barbara is currently undergoing an audit process with the Santa Barbara Fire Department. It's called the Standard of Cover Study, so it's not uncommon for an outside entity to conduct such audits. I'm not sure that a contractor should do the complaint monitoring within that period. It may be helping to set up that process, but maybe not do the actual monitoring of the complaints, if that means looking at the personnel data, because I think that opens up a difficult can to try to work around, but setting up the process for receiving complaints, sharing complaints with the department, and then how what monitoring looks like. I think that would be appropriate.
Damo? Thank you, Lizzie.
Yeah, to your point, I just wonder if it's harder to go from contract to, like, institutional, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like once you start with something, it becomes a harder sell, even if there's value in it. So I think whoever's presenting definitely needs to, like, do, like, sales 101, like, start like, value added, like, what does the independent monitor bring? Like, I think that's got to be part of, like, maybe not in the actual, like, legislation, but in the actual, like, pitch. It needs to be like, this is the value, like, of the monitor, and if this didn't work out, we could go with this, but we'd lose that. So I think we can frame it in a way that's very compelling. But I think if we should start with what we want instead of, like, presenting what we, like, would settle for and then hope that it goes back to what we want, because usually it's hard to do that when it comes to policy stuff.
That's fair. Thank you, Damo. Rachel?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Demo just shared. One of the questions that I remember getting at a couple of our introductory meetings, so, initial presentations to various community groups, was the question of, so how is this going to be different than other things that have been tried in the past, right? I mean, there's so many organizations, and this is not just SBPD, or others that, they have consultants here and there, they have advisory boards here and there that never really do much. So the question is like, what are you going to put in place? Is it really different? Is it going to be something new? Is it going to be something lasting? And so I feel like I get, the conversations where we're talking about really watering down some of our recommendations or helping make them more palatable by making them temporary, or really, doesn't honor the fact that, like, those are legitimate questions that we've been getting from a lot of different sides. And I feel like this is where we really go back to what is our role as the Formation Commission, and it's to make the best possible recommendation. And kind of our integrity is based on a year's worth of learning, and I know that's impossible to convey to the community and to all the stakeholders who are giving us feedback and probably, you know, are disappointed in various decisions we're going to make or have already made. But ultimately, we've put in a lot of work, and I guess I'm not so interested in trimming that away so that it's a little more palatable. And I think this is one of those positions where, yeah, the value of investing in an actual staff position that is not limited by time feels like it is truer to the recommendation that we've been putting together this whole time.
Thank you, Rachel. Kim or Jordan?
So is this something that we take a straw poll on, or is it something that we make a recommendation, not to put more work on Cami, thank you, Cami, to have the language ready and then next week we come to a vote? Just because I know there seems to be a lot of good discussion on this.
Definitely, like, if we could figure out a way to like do like a contingency plan or something, because I mean, I definitely understand your point, but you know what I mean? But it's like, it's just hard to like frame it in a way that's like, you know,
No, I hear you, and it's something that I struggle with quite a bit because my preference is by far a permanent full-time staff. I struggle with the fact that I perceive probably the most proactive and probably the strongest part of our recommendation is the day-to-day monitoring part of following a complaint through the process, ensuring that policies, procedures, and trainings are being met, that that is the part that brings light in, that gives the transparency for the community so that you can build that faith. I do not believe that happens with only a civilian oversight board. So whether it's, I kind of like the idea that maybe we recommend a full-time permanent position, offer an alternative maybe, some sort of language that does something to the.
in the event of like, you know, like financial, whatever.
Is your mic on?
Sorry, I just don't like speaking to the mic. Like in the event of like, you know, a financial, like, you know, uncertainties and stuff, I like the idea of you're saying of just recommending like a backup plan. I just want to make sure, because that's a valid concern you pointed out. Like, I don't want them to swing from, you know, independent monitor to like just the board. But like, you have a better idea of like city council, how the, you know, you can help with that, I'm sure, but
You bring up a really good point.
but how to like frame it so that they don't like just do a 180, you know?
And I think it something that became clear to me when we had the chief present, and I've heard it in conversations, and it's similar to what Lizzie brought up about the fire department auditing. I think it's really important to differentiate auditing from monitoring. Monitoring is ongoing. Auditing is a snapshot in time. So if what city council goes with is we do occasional audits with the COB, it's helpful because it gives us a snapshot in time, but it's not ongoing accountability of holding us to the standards that we set for ourselves in policies, procedures, trainings, which is why I think the monitoring component is so important. Jordan? Oh.
Yeah, and also just to add, sorry, as far as like, even, I used to work in New York, I used to work for an Office of Program Monitoring, and we did a lot of like just data stuff, but we didn't do, it was more auditing, not monitoring. So I think, I don't know how the city here works, but I think we can like, actually just like look at their current setup and just see how capable they are in that role. And if I mean, we can say the strengths they have and, you know, see if there's any weaknesses, but I'm sure like an independent monitor would be like overall stronger. But we can actually say, well, these are your current capabilities and this is why, you know, maybe just more of like could be a little extra work, but just kind of saying the current situation. If you did it in the system, like in-house, we don't think it would be as effective because like this is your current model or staffing or whatever. I don't know.
Gabe, do you
Jamie?
mind if I interject? I think at this point, from what I've heard, it sounds like a majority would like to move forward with language that combines the director position and the ombuds into one position that also then is a full-time staff position. So I don't know if we need to do a straw poll if you feel like that is not the case, but we are closely approaching or quickly approaching the 3-hour mark. And I want to make sure that if there's something different than that, that people have an opportunity to talk about that. Otherwise, I think that I've heard a majority say moving forward with a full-time position.
Yep, that's what it sounds like.
Okay. No issue with moving forward?
Lizzie?
So I've shared this with several commissioners, but I just like for the full commission and the public to understand that, you know, I've been actively involved in criminal justice reform for almost a decade and a half. And if it were up to me, if I was the person that was in charge of drafting an oversight system for every jurisdiction, I would want it to be full oversight for every single law enforcement entity in our nation. But that's not what we're tasked with. We're tasked with providing something that is specific to Santa Barbara. So I know it was discussed earlier, and it was mentioned in earlier commission meetings that we want to be the example for other cities to adopt what we create. But I just want to remind the commission that that's not really our task. Our task is to be very specific to Santa Barbara's needs. And unfortunately, this came about during a global pandemic that resulted in a drastic economic downturn. There are still city employees that have not been repositioned, so they were laid off and not repositioned. So as much as I would hope that we could, as a city, afford a full-time dedicated staff person, I share Chair Escobedo's concern that the city council may not feel that they have the financial ability to do so. So I'm wondering about having a clause that if we do, we recommend a full-time position and having a contractor for the first year. I wonder if the commission or the city council would hear from a oversight professional who's worked with our city for 6 months, 12 months, to say, yes, this is a full-time position, as opposed to the 12 of us who, who are from the community and have our own limited research on this. So I just want to kind of throw that out there as a possible, consideration to add a subclause of a contractor for the first year to set it up.
Can I ask a clarifying question of John regarding what you said earlier about the 3-part test? If you have a contractor for the first year, are you able to hire them as a full-time position?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes,
So- yeah,
okay.
yes,
I
yes.
just wanted to make
Yes.
sure.
If we wanted to make that a permanent position, they would definitely be eligible.
Okay.
Rachel?
Yeah, I just want to ask a question related to what Lizzie was saying. So if the commission wanted to do something where there is a second tier or something, don't we also have a piece of our recommendation that already states that the initial oversight professional, the phase is much longer than a year, because we recognize that it will take a lot of time to do a lot of the setup? And I can't remember the exact language, but I think it was a minimum of 3 or 4 years. Is that right?
Correct. And that was the thought behind it, is it's going to take quite a while for this to get off the ground and for us to be able to actually witness what this looks like and whether or not a full-time position is warranted, a permanent full-time position. So that was the thought, is the evaluation period happens between 3 to 5 years. So if you had a person for 4 years, it would take you through the evaluation process. The city would have much more information, could make an informed decision, was the thought.
Any additional comments on this section?
Kim?
Just really quickly, wanted to harken back to something that was said earlier tonight about this process really being about building trust. And for me, yes, there are definitely financial concerns that I think City Council has to worry about. But for us, I view our charge as being, as Rachel said, creating sort of the best possible recommendation, presenting all the research and the data behind that and the reasoning. And it's for City Council to decide and to tell us and the community why they're making the decisions to move forward that they make. So that's me.
Thank you for that, Kim. Other comments? Doesn't look like it, Cami.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on. Okay, the next section is under the heading of relationship between the Civilian Oversight Board and the Office of Police Oversight. So if we go a little further down, we've already discussed will be a full-time employee of the City of Santa Barbara, but I want to go down to the subsection. A screening committee, including at least one member of the COB, shall interview and evaluate candidates for the director to help determine the top candidates. I'll open that up for discussion.
This was mine. I just wanted to add a clause at the end that just said in accordance with current city policy and procedure.
Any
comment?
additional?
Doesn't look like it. Back to you, Cami.
Can I get clarification on just the timing? So like, will this position be created first or will the COB be created first? Because to me, it seems like this position would be first and then the COB would be created. So to me, that doesn't really make any sense. Unless this
That's a very good
position
point.
leaves and then, so I just would like clarity there.
That's a good point. My thought would be, Cami, how does it usually work with the jurisdiction? Do they hire the oversight professional first and then recruit for COB, something like the COB?
So, yes and no. It depends on how the ordinance is written. In a lot of jurisdictions, most, I would say, that I know of, the method is to hire the director and then appoint the Civilian Oversight Board so that there is an entity that exists for the Civilian Oversight Board to come into. The difference is some jurisdictions, the Civilian Oversight Board is very involved in the hiring process of the auditor or monitor. And so in that case, the Civilian Oversight Board comes in and then so that they can then move forward with the hiring process. But for instance, in Boulder, their director or their monitor was there for about a year, setting up the office, getting everything in place before the board members were appointed.
Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me that that's the way it would work, at least initially, that we would, the city would want the direction of that professional in the process of setting up the board and making sure everything's in place for it. And this is something where, I guess, again, I'm kind of wondering how the commission feels about how specific do we need to get? Should we have a section here that lays that out, that the, hiring priority should be that position, then the selection of the committee happens, then in subsequent years, whether it is at the end of a contractor position or if it's a full-time staff that then turns over, that the COB would then also be involved the way it's kind of laid out here. So, I mean, if that's the level of specificity we want, then I would say we can have a a criteria in this section, the same way we laid out, I think, the initial term limits so that it would be staggered for committee members. So I think it makes sense to maybe expand this section a little bit to lay out that prioritization.
I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. And no other comments, so it sounds like people agree with the way Rachel laid it out.
Great, thank you for that. The next portion that we have to discuss is still in the same section of the recommendations, but this is regarding specifically staff support to the COB with the ability to contract specialized staff. These two subsections are specifically what it was asked that we discuss. The OPO's community ombudsman will staff the civilian oversight board for meetings and trainings. I think that if that portion is eliminated, that position is eliminated, then that would fall to the monitor or auditor's role. So I'm not sure, we still need to discuss that one. And the same with the second piece about working directly with COB to establish annual training schedule. If that position no longer is established, then that will move to the responsibilities of the monitor. Any additional, I don't want to stop conversation from this part. People would like to discuss any part of it further.
Doesn't look like there's any comments.
Great. The last section that we have that was asked that we discuss is under self-evaluation. And this is the evaluation should contain recommendations on improvements regarding the COB's operations. And I will open that up for suggested changes.
This was one of my suggestions. It was just to add the monitor position or the OPO portion of the oversight in this is trying to pull out recommendations for improvements in that part of the recommendation and not just the COB. So the whole recommendation.
Can you repeat that again?
So as it reads right now, the evaluation should contain recommendations on improvements regarding the Civilian Oversight Board's operations. My suggestion was to add what was then the Office of Police Oversight to this as well, to pull out recommendations for improvements for that portion. If we update it, it would be the police monitor, whatever we decide to term it.
That sounds fine to me.
Rachel?
Is it too vague to just say regarding oversight operations? I mean, I know when we called it the Office of Oversight, that would have been broad, I guess, to include both, but.
That would be fine, I think.
Okay. Any additional comments?
Louisa?
Hi, I guess my microphone's been on this whole time. I know everyone's exhausted, but the only last piece that I wanted to bring up was we had a discussion in the past of having an addendum in regards to recommendations to the city council in such things as making recommendations to changing the charter in regards to recommendations for discipline, things like that. I know that the chief spoke about that when we had a long discussion about that, but I did want to bring that back up as a part to discuss with the commission before we end tonight. Thanks.
Christian?
I think this is a really important piece. I don't think that it should be limited to just that conflict. I think there are other things, including maybe even the ombud's position, right? Like, to add as, I don't know if addendum is the right word, but like, I think that has like a specific implication for like, to make it clear that it's like a separate from the recommendations, but that it's part of a recognition that the work will not and should not end after this process is complete and after the city council ultimately makes, either chooses to adopt our language into an ordinance and enact that, or, some other variation. And so I think that it's just sort of a recognition, and an important recognition of there's more work to be done after this. As much as we have all worked really hard on this, it's not a silver bullet. So I think that piece would be important to also signify to the community and other partners that there are other considerations to make in terms of striving for a more perfect community.
Are there particular topics that you would like to include in that portion? So I heard the conflict that John had pointed out about recommendations on discipline is one. In terms of charter amendments, were there any others that you wanted to add?
I think like the issue of staff, right? We've discussed, we're in a difficult economic situation right now as are cities across the United States. So I think it's worthy of consideration for the future. Like, maybe we can staff this better. I would have to get back to you on others, but I think that there are some things that, like we discussed, there's been a lot of brainstorming, and I think that there are other areas, and I would love to hear feedback maybe from the police department as well on that, on maybe there are some things we haven't considered that are part of just this broader, hey, this is one piece of striving for a better community.
Thank you. Any other comments on Louisa's suggestion? And just remember, Cammie did remind us at the beginning, we can send her additional items after this. Just remember that she does want to get us the recommendation language by Friday, so hopefully soon, tomorrow. Serafina?
I just wanted to second Commissioner Wood's comment. I think it is really important to add that part about discipline into, whatever it is separately, because I think that's really important for this board. And again, like, from what we've seen from like the number of complaints and what those complaints contain, like the police department seems to be doing a relatively great job as it is. And I just see this as kind of like an insurance, like just in case something happens to slip through the cracks, we're all human, police officers are all human, in case something happens, this board will have the ability, or could have the ability, to make recommendations on discipline if there is ever something in the future that happens and they need to be able to do that. Hopefully there isn't, but I think it is just important that we make another recommendation for that.
Thank you, Serafina. Lizzie?
Just for clarification, are we making a decision right now, or are we just sort of talking about something?
We're talking about the possibility of including, it was referred to as an addendum or another section that talks about future considerations for city council. So one of the considerations was a city charter amendment that would allow the COB to make recommendations on discipline. Another was on staffing, possibly for that second position, whether it's a community ombuds or another by another title. And so what we're asking is, as Cammie goes back to draft language, if there is something that you wanted to see language on, it's not saying that we're approving it now, but if you wanted to see language on it, now would be the time to let Cammie know. And then if something happens to kind of come to mind after this meeting, you can let Cammie know, but we're asking that it happen sooner rather than later so that she can prepare language before Friday.
Okay, so this is kind of like tier 2 recommendations, not, because hiring a second position isn't associated with the charter amendment, that those are two separate things, so.
Correct, that's why I
Just-
said future
okay.
considerations,
Okay,
so.
so then maybe something that we can discuss next meeting would be one of the recommendations from the department, which I'm open to, is having some of this fall under the current commission of the Fire and Police Commission, or a charter amendment that separates and creates a fire commission and a police commission. That way you don't have two similar commissions with the authority to do similar things, because much of what we're recommending already falls under the Fire and Police Commission.
I think that's, yeah. Yeah, so, other, things in future considerations? Rich?
I just wanted to point out, we already talked about the stipends, and childcare would be part of the addendum as well.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, and I think an addendum would be great of future considerations. So please go
Cool.
forward.
If something comes up after this hearing, please do reach out to Cami with any sort of items that you would like to see some language on. Damo? Mike?
I'll get used to this, I promise. Remember how we discussed when we presented at the law school, we talked about the rule about, I'll look it up, but it's basically the policy about how the city council can't make indirect recommendation, or,
It was referring to closed sessions.
Closed sessions,
And
okay.
John had mentioned, it was one of the, it's part of making the discipline recommendations and
Mhm.
being able to review case files is,
Okay.
it has to meet.
so that's only within like cases, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
closed session. So that
Okay.
was
So
our
that's-
conversation about how we can, how the COB could have access to closed sessions.
Okay. I remember we had a discussion about that, and I just need to look over the actual law again to remember what my thought was.
But I think it was related to the recommendation of discipline.
Yeah,
and-
because my issue is with the interpretation that I want to discuss further, because I thought that was a very narrow interpretation of the idea that the city council, or to take the law that says like you can't make an indirect recommendation and to say that that is basically restricting them from.
Like ordering. them
Yeah,
to-
oh yeah, sorry. It says you can't make an indirect order, that's right.
Yeah.
So that's an interpretation of a recommendation as an indirect order, I think is open to debate. And I just thought like that was a narrow reading of it, because I think an indirect order could be interpreted as more of like a veiled threat. That was, when I think of an indirect order, that's what I think of. I don't think of that as a recommendation. So I just wanted a broader interpretation, at least a discussion of what that could mean. And it doesn't have to be like, it's not settled law, but I just thought,
Maybe we can follow, after this hearing, we can follow up with John Doimus to talk about that more.
Yeah.
And bring back whatever information we get
Yeah,
to the
because-
next meeting.
yeah, because I think a recommendation is not, it's not binding, it's just, there's no reason why there shouldn't be a.
Yeah. So that you and I we'll reach out to John Doimus after the hearing to discuss it more. Thank you, Dama. Anything else? Cami, I'm not seeing any additional items. Back to you.
Thank you. That was, so that concludes all of the areas that were brought up. And then the additional conversation about the addendum. I just want to reiterate that if you do have additional suggestions, particularly surrounded the addendums, since we just started talking about that, the sooner you can get that to me, the better. And then I will work on getting these changes to you by Friday. So thank you, everyone. This has been an excellent conversation. Although your time is winding down on the commission and the work, the amazing work that you've done, the heavy lift that you've taken on, it's coming to an end. It's a pleasure working with you, particularly when I get to be part listen in on conversations like you've had this evening. So thank you, everyone, for this evening and your contributions to this conversation.
Thank you, Cammie. We
Thank
could
you,
not have
Cammie.
done this without you.
Thank you, Kevin.
We appreciate you.
Yes, we do.
Thank you, Cami.
Chair Escobedo, can you give us the next meeting dates?
Yeah, so our next meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday, which is April 13th at 5:30 here in council chambers. And then that is when we are going to finalize our recommendations. So please, when Cammie does send out the language, please look it over and provide Cammie with your feedback as soon as possible, because Wednesday we have to approve the language. Then after that, the group that will be presenting to City Council will spend the next week working on that presentation, and we will present to City Council at the David Gephardt Room, which is at 630 Garden Street, on April 22nd at 1 p.m. And it'll be a joint meeting between us and City Council. We'll get an opportunity to present and have a discussion with them about our recommendation. Did I get that right, Sam?
That's correct, Chair. It's scheduled from 1 to 4 on the 22nd.
1 to 4, thank you. Rachel?
I think this has been asked before, but I'm not sure if it's information that can be shared yet, but are there other presentations that day? Or is council making any decisions on our recommendations on that day?
I think thus far there are no other presentations for that day. It's strictly between the Community Formation Commission to present those final recommendations. There could be questions from the City Council. And I don't expect that there'll be a final decision that day, only because it depends on what the final recommendations are, what council would like to pursue, analyze their cost.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. All right. We
Is
got
our next
one.
meeting in
Wait,
council
hold on
chambers
just
as well?
1 second. So in our meeting on the 23rd,
22nd. 22nd.
I know, but on our meeting on March 23rd, we
Oh,
had,
sorry.
and I'm sorry, it's late. We had assigned some folks had raised their hands to participate in the presentation working group. We had a total of 8 folks sign up for that. That's too many to comply with the Brown Act, and so I just wanted to clarify the membership of that working group so that we can, so that working group can start to put together the presentation and assign speakers and that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I'll willingly step off that.
yeah.
Are you sure? No.
Mine was only if necessary. So you can-
John, actually, I do have a question for you, if you're still there.
Absolutely. I'm here. I'm here.
Uh,
Yes, sir.
Once we have our draft recommendation finalized, are we able to meet, like, let's say we did have 8 folks who wanted to present, are we able to meet together in order to prepare that presentation? Still
No,
not?
still over a quorum. Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately. That's the Brown Act rule, because you have a quorum there and, things can be discussed. I know it wouldn't happen, but.
Even if
it's
we
the
can't
Brown
make a
Act.
decision to change,
Even if we can't, I definitely can't do that. It would have to be, at this point now, 6 or less.
so when does our term end? Is it the day after our council presentation?
It could, or, I don't know, council could decide to extend it depending on what occurs, I don't know, but right now, at least, it would probably end around that time. There's no set date, but depending on how the recommendation goes, as soon as the recommendation is accepted and final, councils, could ask you to come back and do something else, I don't know the answer to that, so, but it's close to the end, but I can't give a date certain, yeah.
So you're saying if we wanted to celebrate after council
Oh, no,
presentation?
no, that's different. There's no business discussed at all right yet. No. I think we'll be good. We'll
Okay.
be good on that.
Thank you,
in that
John.
regard. So you're welcome.
So with that, for the presentation group, I think off the top of my head, I had Serafina, Louisa, Jordan, Anna, myself, Rachel, Rich, Christian.
Only if
Damon?
necessary.
Damo?
So I'm happy to step off, but I also would like to just raise for the presentation that if we can assign people,
Yeah, that's what I
that
was-
would be great. So like if the organizing group can assign different areas for people,
Good
that
idea.
way that we can all participate, that'd be awesome to me, if we're able to. So maybe that's a compromise there.
I like
I'm
that
happy to
idea.
step off.
I will also choose to step off.
Stop stepping off.
Do you know what we do? Well, I would like to present, but for the purposes of you to develop the curriculum, sorry, I'm a teacher, I will take a step back on that, but I would like to present.
Okay.
So assign what I need to do.
So, as a part of the crew that will be assigning folks parts of the presentation for them to develop, me, Christian. Are there other folks that would like to be? Rachel?
And this is to do what? This is to, so. I had volunteered, but I'm planning on being there. I don't need to present, but I would be willing to take the time to help create that presentation materials.
So that may be part of this group, because that's what we're gonna do, and then assign parts of the presentation to particular
Yeah.
commissioners. Okay, perfect, so
Same, I can help with that. If you guys need someone extra to help preparing stuff, I can help as well.
the last one.
Yeah,
That's
I'm always on
number
the,
5.
on the fence.
Was, myself, Christian, Rachel, you, Damo, we will work on the presentation and assign it to commissioners that will be presenting. So we'll assign folks particular portions of the presentation. All right, problem solved. All right, well, with that, we have one more meeting, y'all. Appreciate you. We will call this meeting over at 8:52. Everyone have a good night. Be safe. Thank you, Cammie.
Thank you, Cammie.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Talk to you soon.
Almost midnight there, so.